Hi, is someone there? Hello?
Good afternoon or morning.
Hi, Peter.
Hello.
There's another person signed in as the meeting moderator also. Who is that?
I don't know.
Oh,
So good.
they typed a chat. That was not me. So there's a real person on that account.
Okay, so should one of you be the chat monitor? And
yeah, so it could be Shannon is going to be moderating.
well,
there's someone else who's the chat monitor, and I'm supposed to be just doing the Zoom technical.
I'm not overly concerned. Shannon's typically acted as rapporteur, although she engages in the moderation at times as well. So I think as long as we can agree that one person is the chat monitor. It depends how many people we have as well. The last session we had a smaller group of probably about 15. And so the moderation and the chat monitoring wasn't particularly challenging.
Okay.
So maybe we'll just wait and see. And then we can't hear you. Is that about me?
No, that's the other person.
Okay. Yeah, they mentioned they had a microphone problem.
Yeah.
Okay. So it doesn't seem to be a problem that two people are logged in as moderator. So are you able to act then as chat monitor? Would that be okay? Or
yeah, I think that's, I don't know how you pronounce this. How? I don't know if that's correct. Yeah. Okay. Then John, I think, is going to be the chat monitor. At least that's how things are assigned out.
Yeah, the only issue there is, and I think you'll need to get your microphone working, because I don't think we can easily have a chat monitor if you speak.
That's true.
So if that can be sorted in the next 15 minutes or so, and then if not, maybe if we could just switch roles, that would be more productive. And as I said, I'm not overly concerned. We've managed to make it all work. So I'm just going to test my screen share.
Great.
And sorry, first I'm going to clean up my desktop a little. Okay. Start, and you should see my browser with the agenda.
Yep, that looks good.
Great, and then I'll stop that, and then you should now see my presentation.
Yep, that looks good.
Okay.
And do you know, Peter, are there going to be breakout sessions or anything in this meeting? Or
No,
is this okay?
No, or that's not the plan. We haven't done that. This is meant to be potentially a sort of, what do they call it? A cross fertilization, or to try and get other working group members to join. So we may have, slightly different than the theme that I mentioned in the agenda, but just trying to get the AOS agenda for today up. I think it's a cross-cutting themes. So yeah, cross-cutting breakout sessions. So we shall see. Okay, I'm just going to stop my.
Oh, and I think Shannon just logged on also.
Okay, great.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Shannon. Good morning. Or
Good
afternoon.
morning. No, it's morning here. Our first session was very, very early.
Mm-hmm.
It's just on 8 o'clock here in Calgary.
Great. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going into session 4.
Okay, I will share my screen again. And I'll wait and just leave this up for now.
Okay, is there anything else that we need to test or go over before we get started?
Are you able to, there's a statement that has been read in some of the other sessions. I don't know that we have to do that. It's been done many times, I guess, before, but I don't know if you have that on hand. I don't seem to have it handy.
I think there is, I don't know, Shannon, if you were going to do that as the moderator. Let me see.
I don't actually have that information. It wasn't given to me.
No, so that's why I don't think Shannon is the moderator. Are you, Shannon? I thought you're the...
I've been told that I am.
Oh, okay. So I'm just wondering if it's in the code of conduct.
I think it's here.
There we go.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's in the code of conduct.
Let me see. And I'll go ahead and make both of you hosts.
Actually, that is not what has been
Can you hear
read.
me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Finally.
Okay. Yeah, there it is. The script. There's the script. So Shannon, are you able then to, if you just go to the AOS2020agenda.org/how to join,
Yes.
and then if you go down to, I realize I'm not sure what the difference between a moderator and a chat monitor is, but
I'm not the chat monitor. I'm just the moderator. Though
okay.
I think I might end up being the chat monitor.
Well, yeah, at this stage, again, we'll see how many we have. It wasn't particularly difficult either way last time. And I'm generally okay to monitor the chat and, you know, the hands up and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think we might have a lot of people to do these couple jobs. So
Yeah, so maybe if it's okay, Shannon, if you could do the read script and then...
Is it just the code of conduct that I send out to everybody?
Generally what we've done is just put that into the chat.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, and
Okay.
but the script has been read. The thing that I'm showing on the screen here.
yeah, and I put a link to that thing that Peter has up in the chat. So
okay, and it is
Oh, great.
useful to actually read out this stuff. I initially, on my first session, I ended up just saying these things, but if we read it at the beginning, we don't need breakout rooms. But all these others, maybe if you can just start us off with that, and then I'll just go into the content. And this is a cross-cutting session as well, I guess. I'm just sort of realizing from the agenda. So we may have people from other working groups who come in. So I've just quickly put together kind of a summary, very, very high level summary slide of what we've covered in the other discussions. And then because we're also on to focus on platforms and that, just put in a couple of quick slides, and then David's going to spend a few minutes on PolarTep as an example of a platform. I reached out to Lola Lessa to see if she was available, but I haven't heard back. So. Okay, chat, we have chat.
yeah, and if people do have technical issues, you can just tell them to chat directly to the meeting moderator accounts, and we'll take care of that. But otherwise, I'll sit back and let you guys take it, and only speak up if there's, something in the chat that you don't catch or something like that. I'll keep an eye on it.
Perfect. Yeah, and then just if we're running into issues, we can just sort of figure it out on the fly.
Yep.
Okay. So in that script, I think is there's a point about if you need help, just put it into the chat or whatever. So if you go through the script, Shannon, then that all should be pretty clear.
Yes, I have it in front of me now to read, so I'm good.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, and I don't know, we should recognize that levels of cognition are diminishing as the day goes on. And yeah, feel free to step in if there's anything that is going sideways.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a few years since I've pulled all-nighters and done that sort of thing. So I'm not used to waking up in the middle of the night a couple days in a row and so on. So. Okay. And yeah, you're even worse, Shannon. Okay.
All right. Hi, Naomi. I think we're, just going to start having people join now.
Hello.
Hi.
Good morning or afternoon. I think we have some background noise as well, so if people can mute when they're not speaking, I'll make sure that's not me. Mute. Okay, for those of you just coming on, we'll just give it a few minutes. This morning it took 4 or 5 minutes after the scheduled time to really get most people online, so we might wait till about 3 minutes after the 2:30 GMT. Good morning. For those of you just joining, we're just giving it a few minutes to let people sign on. We'll probably start about 3 minutes after the 2:30 GMT start time. Good morning or afternoon. For those of you just joining, we're just going to give it to about 2 or 3 minutes after the scheduled time before we get started. Okay, good morning. We're just going to give it about 1 more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we can get started. We'll probably have a few more join us as well. Thanks to all for coming to session 4 of Working Group 4 of the 2020 Arctic Observing Summit. So we'll start out by just asking Shannon to read to us the statement that we need to read just before each of the sessions. I think most of you are familiar with it by now, but nevertheless, we'll read it for anybody who's not familiar or needs reminding. So Shannon, I'll ask you to do that, and then we'll get started with our agenda.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome, depending on where you are in the world. The circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary home to many different indigenous peoples. As researchers and others who are working in or reside in the Arctic, we recognize these lands and waters as the mostly unceded traditional homeland of the indigenous peoples. It is the responsibility of each of us to learn, know, and gain better understanding of the indigenous people and cultures with which we engage. With that in mind, let's engage in open-minded community-building collaboration as described by the ASSW Code of Conduct, which I will be sharing in the chat window. Some logistics before we start the presentation. You joined with your camera off and your audio muted. If you unmute yourself at any time, please remember to remute after speaking. How to mute. Press *6 if your phone does not have a dedicated mute button. Please keep your phone muted during the presentation and do not put us on hold. Why? Because we can all hear your typing and conversations when you aren't muted, and the hold button may cause disruption in the presentation. If you have the option, please use headphones or a headset. If you are on the phone, please turn your computer speakers all the way down. We can get an echo when the phone picks up your computer audio. If you need to see your controls, you can hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen. You can also chat and see other participants via these controls. If you have a question, type your questions into the chat window and they will be read out loud by the chat monitor. You can also message the moderator via the chat tool or the raise hand tool, which is accessed by opening the participants window. Let's see, want to join the discussion, unmute yourself and speak up, or raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you. Or you can send a chat message to the group, everyone, and the moderator will read the question out loud. For people without microphones, type into the chat monitor will read questions out loud. This presentation will be recorded. A video file, audio file, slides, and relevant links will be available on the agenda tab of the AOS website. And people have been asking if the chat window discussion will also be available. It will. And at this point, Peter, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you, Shannon. As I mentioned, we're at session 4 of Working Group 4. As I've said in other sessions, we do have a theme that we're looking at focusing on, which is around emerging technologies and methods, particularly things like machine learning and data platforms and so on, analytical platforms. Any topic is open to discussion though, knowing that not everyone can make each session. And so if you do have other topics that you want to discuss, certainly bring them up. This is a 90-minute session, so it's relatively short compared to the others. So we will stay as focused as we can. Later today, there'll be 2 other sessions, or a session this evening, I guess GMT time, where we'll start writing and putting together discussion or the statement for AOS that we're looking to provide at least a starting point for the presentations tomorrow for the broader group. And then tomorrow morning, we will also do the same thing. I may be a little bit late due to another commitment that I have, but I should be on this evening. So for any of you interested in doing that, you're welcome to join. If not, a small group of us have been taking notes, and Shannon's been doing an amazing job at taking great notes as we've gone through. So thank you for that, Shannon, and we'll use that extensively in our writing session. So with that, I'm just going to go quickly into a short overview presentation. I'll stop sharing this screen, and then I've invited David Arthurs is going to just tell us a little bit about the analytical platform that he is involved with called Polartep, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So just bear with me a moment, and I'll go. You should now see my screen. So before we get into any discussion about platforms and emerging technologies and methods, in terms of previous sessions, we've had many discussion threads, a lot of really good discussion over the course of the day and a half or so. In the area of community building and the social institutional aspects, we've certainly identified engagement with other organizations is important, and we have a number of very specific recommendations there, particularly in the data sphere, groups like ESIP and others. There's also a number of global initiatives, United Nations initiatives, et cetera, that we're mapping out and wanting to try to make sure that we're connecting there. We talked a lot, particularly in the last session earlier today, about capacity building and reward structures, but that also came up yesterday. That's a big part of what we need to think about, or we need to think about that within the data community. Some of our issues of moving forward effectively relate to lack of capacity and reward structures that don't work. Use of virtual meetings. So obviously with the current COVID-19 situation, that's something that we're all having to live, but we're also recognizing that could be a very effective way to keep our momentum going on certain activities, et cetera. User engagement has come up a lot. How do we better engage with end users, with various actors who are part of our community, and including thinking about co-production models. And another one that I think was very important, which is just direct engagement and broader initiatives. So rather than having, the data manager silo or the data community sort of sitting, as we're doing here in some ways, together talking, have those people, as part of the larger discussions, whether that be with a community project, whether that be with a scientific project, and so on. So those are some of those higher level community building themes and technical themes. We had a lot of discussion about federated search, where we're at there, where we want to go, particularly around schema.org, which is a particular standard that's being used in that domain. Semantics came up a lot as well. So there's quite a bit of interest and activity there. And looking at, for example, linking it to the presentation that Bill Manley made on an effort to map out or to document the observing assets in the observing system, and how we can use vocabularies, et cetera. And that would also link to the schema.org and federated search work. Persistent identifiers have come up a number of times. So how do we ensure that we can use those to our advantage? And then related to above, with user engagement, thinking about user experience, how do we make tools that can be used by a broader range of end users, thinking about, right from user interface right through to different mediation strategies and methods, et cetera. And then the topic of today's session, which is emerging technologies and methods, and where we're going on that front. So with that, one area certainly that's really taken off in the last 5 years in particular is this idea of data and analytical platforms. So rather than having data sources online where people download it, unzip the file onto their desktop, and then use the data there, allowing them to go to a cloud-based platform that has an environment that includes, at least the large data sets or the big data, but also gives them capacity to upload their own data and analyze it in various ways, also possibly community collaboration tools and things like that. So there are a few examples on the screen capture here, and some of these are relatively open. Others are closed, like the NASA Above. You need to be part of the NASA Above, but it's a tool that's being used extensively by that community. And at least last time I checked, you needed to be part of the NASA Above project to use that. But we're also seeing, certainly beyond our community, there are hubs and platforms that are being developed, and I think it's all relatively new, but moving very quickly. We also see a lot happening in the area of machine learning, and what's happening there, artificial intelligence, that sort of thing. I'll just go to my next and last slide quickly. We did have a white paper submitted to this session through the Arctic Observing Summit on that. But just before I do that, you can't read it well, but down on the lower left-hand side of this slide under the OGC testbed slide, they're also looking at things like federated cloud approaches and activities. So how do you actually connect these various initiatives using interoperable or these various platforms using interoperable techniques and standards and protocols and so on. As one of our guests at a workshop that we held in Italy a couple of years back from the OGC said, he sort of said, initially they're looking at the service-to-service interoperability. Now they're looking at the cloud-to-cloud interoperability. So it's changing. Unfortunately, Ivan Sudakov had to withdraw his paper. He wasn't able to attend AOS, but the paper is still available on the Arctic Observing Summer website. So this is just an example, in this case, of how he and his group are applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to their science, and how the algorithms, one of the conclusions, need to be beyond data mining. They're, in this case, analyzing remote sensing data and feeding it into an ecosystem model. So you can feel free to read that paper. And sorry, I'm just trying to catch up with the chat here. I'll do that in a moment, but it's just one example, very applied example of how it's being used. There are many, many others out there in our community. So with that, what I generally have been trying to do here is just address a number of questions. Sorry, I'm just going to go up here to our last one. And have these general ideas or questions around it. So any updates and current developments, partners that we should be working with in this space, approaches to collaboration, what are the visions and what are capacity, et cetera. So before we get into that, as I said, I've invited David to give us an overview of the PolarTEP platform, because it is one that is polar specific, and he's certainly very experienced in what's involved in developing something like this with their team, and then we can open it up to broad discussion. Okay, so I'm just quickly skimming. If there's anything that you do want to say or is important before we move forward, feel free to jump up now and speak based on the stuff that's going into the chat window.
That was just, that's for me, it's Pierre. That was just residue from the last session, just to pick up on those implementation plans. No action needed, no discussion needed here, unless we want to pick it up later, maybe in collaboration.
Okay, excellent.
And I've already copied into the notes, Pierre.
Excellent, thanks to both of you. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to see, first of all, are there any questions or comments before we start with the presentation? Okay, well, with that, I will ask David to see if he can share his screen, and we can go from there. Okay, we can see David, and if you just want to put it into presentation mode, we should be good to go.
Sorry, Peter, it took me a while to figure out how to unmute.
Right.
Good. I don't seem to be able to put this into, oh, maybe I can. Okay, you can see my presentation?
Yes.
Great. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of PolarTEP and where it fits in the so-called polar data ecosystem. Some of you have seen variations on this presentation before. For those who haven't, I'll give a quick overview of what PolarTEP is, and I'll probably spend most of my time focusing on where we are currently going, so basically what's new. So PolarTEP is one of what are becoming increasingly available, this idea of virtual research platforms. And the idea of a virtual research platform is that in a world where the volume of data is growing, and in particular Earth observation data, the traditional model of researchers going out and finding data here and there and probably spending a lot of time in that search and downloading the data to their desktop just isn't going to work. The data volumes in some applications we're talking about would almost break the internet. So the idea of PolarTEP and platforms like it is an environment where people can come together, they can collaborate if they want. They have the data in the cloud. They use tools and algorithms that are there, or they upload their own algorithms, and they have access to computing power and storage and analysis that they wouldn't have otherwise. ESA started this idea some couple of years ago now. They've created, what are we up to, 7 so-called thematic exploitation platforms. PolarTEP is one of those 7, and we work to a greater or lesser extent with the others too. ESA's view of data and computation and how all that fits together is shown in this slide. Others have similar views, and this view is also shared by the European Union. So you can see that PolarTEP is in the second level down, where the so-called services layer. On top of us are basically the users and other services that feed data into our world. And in particular, the Copernicus services are important in the polar context. Below us are levels of computing platforms. And some of you may be familiar with the DIAS concept in the EU. PolarTEP actually sits on one of the DIASes at the moment. And then below that, at the bottom layer, is the data generation layer. The focus here, not surprisingly, given that it's ESA, is on Earth observation, but it certainly includes all of the in situ and other types of data collection mechanisms. So that brings us to PolarTEP itself. There's a picture there of our current user interface. We provide polar relevant data and tools and processing in the cloud. We allow users to bring their algorithms to the data. We also provide algorithms contributed by others. And if you're interested in contributing your algorithm for use by the world, this is a mechanism whereby you can do that. We view ourselves as a central hub in the polar data ecosystem. So we're part of an ecosystem. We recognize that. We put a lot of effort into working with the other parts of the ecosystem. We've been operational now for about a year, but we're constantly in a state of development, which I'll be getting to. And the most important message here is we're interested in collaboration. So if you have tools, if you have data, if you want to use the power of PullRTEP, please get in touch with us. From a systems point of view, this is what we look like. There are different pieces to the TEP, and of course, since we connect to the outside world, there's a lot more complexity outside of what we're responsible for. But we have access to data. We have a data catalog. We have a development environment where you can develop algorithms. We have an execution environment where you can run those algorithms on the data. And we have interfaces based on OGC to the extent we can, and other standards where they're more useful to the outside world. Of course, the TEP's only as useful as the data that you can access. This gives you a flavor for what's there now. Certainly all of the Sentinel missions, plus the historic ESA type satellites and ESA member missions. All the Copernicus services, which tend to be based on Sentinel data. We're in the process of extending our data. Hopefully we'll have RadarSat 1 data available soon. We still have hopes for RadarSat Constellation mission. There are internal Canadian issues to do with that. I'll get to the linkages that are being made to the other polar data in the world in a second. And if all else fails, you can bring your own data. So where we're going from here. I'll touch briefly on a few things here. Importantly, the CCADI project, which you may have heard from in other presentations, is allowing us to integrate with other data in the world. HopsWorks is a machine learning platform, so machine learning is front and center in what we're doing currently. We're running on a DIAS, and we're playing with the concept of data cubes. So each of those we're on, of the DIASes, there are about 5 of them at the moment. We happen to be on Creo DIAS. That's giving us access to currently 15 petabytes of EO data, increasing by terabytes a day. Gives us access to large-scale compute, including GPUs for machine learning applications. A number of the people on this call are also involved in the CCADI project. This is a Canadian-funded project that's focused on data interoperability. PullRTEP is providing the processing platform within the CCADI project. And we're contributing processing, but the project's going to have significant result in significant improvements to PullRTEP to do with the data we can access, to do with visualization, and the addition of increased processing resources. Data cubes are next greatest thing. We're playing in this area a bit. We don't have anything to offer publicly yet here, but stay tuned. Machine learning is seems to be the biggest topic in everybody's minds. We are bringing a number of platform capabilities. HopsWorks is one of them. And just today we received funding from ESA to increase our machine learning resources that we can provide. So if you're interested in machine learning, please get in touch. We have an active community now on sea ice classification to be done by machine learning. And that brings me to my final slide. Another thing we can contribute to our community is a discussion forum. if you have any topics you would like to use this tool for, it's freely available to the community. The picture I have here is the current discussion forum for sea ice charting via machine learning. And that's it.
Sorry. Thank you very much, David. I appreciate that. And like to go out to our participants, see if there are any questions for David or comments. And forgive me for just a moment. I'm just trying to get the participants view up. Mark Parsons.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, Dave. This is Mark Parsons, Rensselaer Polytechnic. I was wondering if you could just say a bit more about the relationship between PolarTEP and Copernicus, both in terms of the data and the services, how that all interrelates.
Yeah, so it's a requirement of all the dioceses that they have access to all of the Copernicus services data, and that they provide all of the Copernicus satellite data, the Sentinels. So PolarTEP itself has access to all of that data, whether it's the raw satellite data or the analyzed data. A lot of PolarView's members are also contributors to the Copernicus services, so we've also got relationships through that route.
Okay, so is it fair to say that PolarTEP is sort of the PolarView into Copernicus?
Yes, I got to be a little careful. We get into politics here. So
Right.
the TEPs are creatures of the European Space Agency, and Copernicus is a creature of the European Commission.
Wow.
And while they claim to work together, it's a complicated relationship.
Yes.
But there is no other polar focus. Well, I shouldn't say it. There's no other platform which is polar focused that has better access to Copernicus. But for example, the Copernicus Marine Service provides a lot of, because it's ocean focused, it's got all the sea ice information, et cetera. But it's only a data repository. It's not a processing capability.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Any other questions, comments? Pier.
Thanks for the great presentation. It's really cool architecture that's being set up. So two things. One on the strategic level. In the chat, again, there was this discussion about the kind of architectures we're setting up for interoperable nodes in a global Earth observation system. And I think I like that way that you mentioned this. Because of politics, because of sensitivities, whenever we have like a nugget of capacity, that's really powerful. I mean, this pulls together so much of Copernicus's power. That's something that should be able to slot into another system because it solves a problem and makes it easier for other components to push their solutions. So I think that's definitely a conversation to be had about how to plug all of this in a common architecture. Taco raised a really good point that we have some funding for this Ocean Info Hub through UNESCO, IODE, to try to have a few meetings on that and figure it out. And it would be really great to push that forward. Second question, more low level, or point really more low level, and a question. So the Polar Semantics Working Group, so AI divides into two major arteries, the machine learning and the knowledge representation, like ontologies, et cetera. They approach the problem from different ways. So we've also worked, so Ruth Durer primarily was motivating this, worked to get the sea ice classification in the knowledge representation slot. So like different nodes in an ontology. It would be really cool to be able to map that to what the machine learning agents are pushing out and see if we can then update that classification in a sort of principled, data-driven way on one side and knowledge-driven way on the other side. Is that something that would be an interesting thing to pick up or look at?
Incredibly, yes. So please get involved with our machine learning group. I'm hoping that to some extent those linkages are already being made, but there's always room for improvement.
Mm-hmm. Would you mind putting like a contact in the chat or something of that kind?
Yes.
Great, thanks. I'll forward that on to the Polar Semantics group and we'll see what we can do.
Okay.
Okay, we have a question from Hazel. Hazel, did you want to share your question verbally, or did you want me to read it out?
Sure, I can do that.
Sure.
Thanks for the presentation. That was really interesting. I was curious if you were able to track through this data portal which data sets are being most used, and sort of specifically maybe for one project, the full trajectory from observing system to end product.
Sorry, could we track that?
Yeah.
We don't currently. Currently we're focused on Earth observation data, so I'm not sure that currently it would get at what I think you're trying to get at, which is very interesting. So that's something we should look at in the future. My only slight hesitation is that when I start tracking what people are doing, I run afoul of many policies concerning tracking what people do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, just curious.
And because we're based in Europe, those issues are front and center, and we've got formal statements about what we track and how we let people know, et cetera, et cetera. It gets really complicated really quickly. But I share, you know, I'm certainly interested in, I think, the point you're making, so I'll try to think that through.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, comments? Shannon.
Peter, and hi, David. How are you doing today?
Good.
I just wanted to follow up on Hazel's commentary that tracking data sets and the projects they feed into is something that has been brought up as having interest in CCADI as well. And again, I'm still not sure if tracking policies and stuff will allow us to do it, but it has been brought up by some of our participants as of interest as well. And I just wanted to mention that it's something that has been thought of.
Yeah, I think maybe you're understanding this, but I've been in a lot of the observing side meetings, and there's a lot of interest in understanding, obviously, which observing systems are the most useful and how they're being used for different applications. So even if it's not individual projects, but some sort of wider view, just food for thought, I guess.
Great, it's a great question, and something to think about as well as we think about this idea of the hub ecosystem has been mentioned here, and that we've had in various visions and papers and so on, is thinking about those things, about tracking the lineage and all of that. And this comes back, I think, to discussions of persistent identifiers and all kinds of other topics that have come up in our discussions over the last couple of days and beyond. So, any other questions or comments? Yeah, one thing I'll put out there just while people are thinking about this. So Taco, we have noted your points about the Ocean Info Hub and related, and that you and Pier have mentioned. Would like to find out more about the specifics of that, and the resourcing. You mentioned, you know, potential resources for workshops, etc., and what that would look like. I think there's probably, in keeping with our comments and discussions in earlier sessions about having, you know, the data community sitting at the table with the observing community and you know, local communities, etc., is that maybe something that's at the SAON level, rather than just, you know, at the Arctic Data Committee or at the data community level. I don't know enough about exactly what the meetings are, or the funding and so on, but that's something that we're seeing lots of crossover here when we think about, documenting the assets and all of those sorts of things as well. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, whether you're strictly looking at data infrastructure in these meetings or this effort, or whether it's sort of more broad. And actually, I think Taco is probably gone by now. He did send me a message saying that that he had to step away for another conference call. So Pier, I don't know if you have any more insight into the project and the funding that Taco mentioned.
Sorry, that was a race to unmute myself across multiple screens. I was like screaming in the background. Okay, yeah. So this is a project funded by one of IODE's main funders from Belgium. We put in a proposal in summer last year, and then it was eventually approved. And so there is funding. It's not massive, but it's not to be sniffed at. Available to set up the Ocean Info Hub, and associated with that, something called the Otis architecture. Now that's the interesting thing, I think, for this group, because that's that interoperability architecture. And again, it's planning to reuse as much as we can and motivate standards agencies to extend standards where necessary. And that with that architecture, that would allow anybody to push information and pull information between their resources. Like, so if you queried a European data aggregator, they could pass that query on to the US or to the Australians or in Africa. That's the vision. And so there's fundings for a few workshops and few like road mapping design workshops. And I think that's a really great opportunity to extend it even further, because there's no reason we should keep that just to the ocean. It's our focus, of course, for the UN decade, but if we can extend it to others, it would be really, really fantastic. Again, I think a lot of people here have a lot of knowledge on what has worked in the past and which groups we should be talking to kind of get our act together and actually build this thing. There's a lot of motivation to do it because of this UN decade. So people really want to see something materialize. And there's also a couple of UN agency meetings happening down the line to get the other agencies like UN Environment, who are building the World Environment Situation Room, and others who have similar ideas to kind of agree and pool resources on this. So that's some background from my side.
Great, thank you. I'd be interested, I don't know that we can go in a lot of depth here, but whether or not it's connecting, this initiative is envisioning connecting with other architectures. In particular, I think about within both the Arctic Data Committee and our CCADI project have a relationship with the Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure Group. They're very much coming from national mapping agencies, but they're also partnered, for example, with IHO, and they're coming more from the OGC side of things. And they have all kinds of sort of models, architectures that we're looking into. At the same time as we look at our CCADI project, we see different flavors of architecture coming from the oceans community for one of our use cases. So it'd be interesting to have, multiple domains, data domains, those sort of different groups be sitting down. We've started that process in Helsinki, where we had a number of these groups sitting together, but there's still, I think, some separation there. So any thoughts you have on that would be interesting.
That's great, because again, it's early days and there's a really strong move to reuse as much as possible, because the resourcing is there, but it's not enough to rebuild architecture from scratch. And as we know, that would be a nightmare anyway, in terms of backwards compatibility. So yeah, if other groups have experience about what works and what doesn't, certainly I think we can get some invitations to the workshops or digital workshops, as may be the case. But that would be fantastic, because then automatically we can plug into the resourcing, digital resources on that side. And that's part of the whole implementation philosophy behind this thing.
Great. Well, what I'd like to do is maybe follow this up after the AOS. I know we're scheduled to speak on later in the week. There was also a lot of discussion at the last Polar Data Forum in Helsinki. There was an oceans workshop held there for Arctic Oceans data. Eric Book, who's not on this call but has been on a couple of our calls this week, led that workshop, and we were even talking about a Polar Data Forum for the oceans. coming out of that. And of course, then COVID hit. So our plans on that at the moment are kind of stalled a little bit, or at least we're delayed. But that may be something that we could develop in partnership with this.
That makes sense, because then it nests within the whole sort of ocean hierarchy, well, the ocean interoperability structure. And if like you guys can lead the polar part of that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so what we're looking at doing too is Eric wanted to focus on the oceans community that I had suggested through ADC and our partners, GCW and all kinds of others, that we can try and bring as many people, you know, obviously we can't let it grow too much, but have representatives at least from these different communities of practice and so on sitting at the table. So great. Any other comments, questions, thoughts, either related to David's presentation or the general themes of platforms, emerging technologies and methods, or anything in general? Okay, I noticed Matt has just put in some information that we'll note. Okay.
That's I mean, it's a really good point. Matt, Peter, could I respond briefly?
Sure. Yeah.
So I like working on the biomedical side with the biomedical ontology crowds. We get to see some of what the medical data community are doing with data that has to be strongly protected, obviously. And, you know, there are companies that provide those sort of secure, encrypted holdings of patient data, where you can then send code to analyze it all, but you only ever get back anonymized and heavily anonymized data back. So, yeah, there are ways to do it. And that's also in the terms of like creating, creating opportunities for new kinds of businesses or models, creating those sort of highly encrypted services that can then return anonymized data and allow you to sort of analyze these sets could be interesting. I don't know if that's what you're thinking about, Matt.
Yeah, it is. To some extent. I mean, there's the issue of the anonymized data itself, but this was more in response to the discussion that Hazel brought up about wanting to know if there were usage data for Copernicus, and David's statement that things like GPDR get in the way of doing that because tracking people is difficult in that policy environment. And so that was a consideration for the counter code of practice for research data. And I think that there was a lot of effort made specifically to make sure that that specification allowed reports that fell well within the confines of GPDR. So that's really good. And if people want an overview, we wrote a kind of a high-level book describing usage metrics and citation metrics that I put in there. And the counter code of practice itself, the specification is publicly accessible. And I think it would be awesome if all of these portals were reporting usage in consistent ways. Then we would have a much better understanding of the ecosystem and impact of the data services that we're all providing.
Okay, thanks to both of you on that. I'm just making a note of that for the statement as well, just this general concept of metrics and reporting usage and so on, because I think that is
Peter, maybe I just weigh in on that. Sitting here as the person responsible for one of these platforms, I really see how this data would be useful to the community. On the other hand, the easiest thing for me to do is nothing, because as soon as I do something, it puts me in danger of running afoul of laws, etc. Thinking of what would make my life easier, which tends to be what I focus on, is if there was a project, if the community got together and said, we're really interested in this, and we're going to decide what data we want and how we want it collected, and we're going to write some things about how it's not afoul of the laws, that allows me to easily know what I need to do and feed into something that's bigger than I am. So if there are people out there who are interested in this question, and I think you should be, if you could formalize it slightly, that would make my life a lot easier and probably everybody else that's sitting in my situation.
So this is Matt. There is a project, Make Data Count, that has been trying to do this for the last 4 or 5 years. That has been formalized into a specification, the Counter Code of Practice for Research Data, that comes from the Counter organization, which is the primary group that is standardized web-based usage reporting for publishers for the last couple of decades. And there's a specification that guides how that kind of reporting should be handled. And a bunch of the major, for example, DOI issuers like DataCite and Crossref have built services around aggregating usage reports in a way that is useful for reporting and building out frameworks. David, I'd love to, is that the kind of formalization you're asking for? Or is you're looking for something different?
That's not what I was thinking of, though it might work, but that sounds generic. That sounds like a good foundation, but I was thinking more of someone who wanted to do this specifically for the polar data community and had a little project from a polar point of view rather than a generic data point of view.
Interesting. Do you think the polar community has?
I don't think it's as complicated as you think it is, Dave. It's so as Matt said, it's been formalized and gone through a lot of community vetting. But at the end of the day, really all it is agreeing on a consistent way to count data accesses. And that's something that I think PolarTep would want regardless, that you'd want to know which data sets are getting the most use. Not, regardless of whether you share the data or anonymize it or whatever. It's just something that I'm really surprised you don't assess anyway. And this is just a way to do it consistently so we can compare apples to apples when we're looking across data systems.
Yes, so I agree. We need to do it for our own strategic purposes. But it would be nice to know that, and I might do it slightly differently if there was someone in the outside world who said, I'm going to try to collect this data from, all of the nodes in the polar data ecosystem as I think the intent is here, for example, when you're making funding requests for new data collection systems, it would be nice to say, yes, we can quantitatively prove that ocean buoys are really, really valuable, or something along those lines.
Well, then maybe this is something that comes out in the papers that we ultimately produce, is that, we encourage polar repositories and data services to use consistent counting methods, such as Project Counter.
Okay, I need to find out more about that foundational work.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. That's a good thread. And I'm just adding a note here for our statement, because I do think this is important. And we also, with respect, David, to the issues of privacy and so on, this is where I think we could draw in our colleagues in the social sciences as well. There might be some things there. Mark mentioned anonymization and so on, that you could share it at some level without actually identifying specifics and so on. Okay, any other follow-on questions or comments?
So I have another question for you, David, which I think has been always a little problematic for me. I totally understand and agree with the notion that data are getting large enough now that we really need hubs where you can bring computing to the data rather than the vice versa. And at the same time, the logical conclusion for that, to me, is that all data should be in one centralized warehouse, and there should only be one place we go to do data and compute. Because really, you know, can we afford to have, say, 100 or, you know, we have a very large distributed infrastructure right now around the world, and that distributed infrastructure probably can't afford to replicate all of the data that we're collecting in many different hubs. So how do you reconcile that sort of inherently distributed nature of these different cloud? People talk about the cloud as if it's one thing, but it's really lots of different things. How do you reconcile that with the sort of need for centralization?
I certainly don't see that we're looking at data replication here. So Pulsifer does not want to be a data repository, for example. We can if there's no other choice, but it's definitely not our first choice. So we're looking at standards that allow us to, in the short term, where we're at from an evolution point of view is that we can access the data we need and only bring it to Pulsifer when it's needed for processing. The vision of the future, in fact, is that we can start to distribute the processing. So if there's a large data set someplace else, we don't download that data to Pulsifer. Excuse me. We make a request and send the processing to where the data is. So I'm looking at more distribution rather than less, and I certainly wouldn't really support centralization.
I'll just jump in there and say, though, I think what Matt highlights is a conclusion that I think people, particularly in the research community, tend to draw, which is that, yeah, if you can put stuff onto, you know, a platform, why not put it onto a platform rather than multiples? This certainly comes up in a lot of the discussions that I engage in, sort of at higher levels, if you will, not necessarily higher, but different organizations, in the science organizations, and this sort of ministerial type activities. And, you know, my comment there is there definitely could be seen as an economic or even a technical benefit to that, but there are all kinds of reasons that it won't happen and shouldn't happen for, you know, geopolitical reasons, redundancy reasons, you know, single point of failure, and all of that. But it's something that, you know, we put in previous statements coming out of not only AOS, but meetings and so on, that, you know, the goal is for a distributed system, not for a, well, it's what's emerging and it's what's desired is how I put it in various presentations. But, you know, any thoughts on that here would be helpful, because it comes up again and again. I know it's coming up in our project in Canada as well, because people are still saying, well, why would we connect these when we could just put all the data into this one system? So thoughts there are welcome.
Yeah, and I'll just comment, David. I guess I misunderstood some of the introductory remarks you made in your first couple slides about the data ecosystem being inherently broken. So maybe I didn't understand you were arguing for a highly distributed system where data are not centralized.
Okay. Yeah, there are certainly nuances here. I'm all for a distributed data system. But not to the extent that you have hundreds of thousands of people downloading data to their desktops. It's always going to be this idea of moving the processing to where the data is and then only downloading the results.
So
just as a concrete example, I'm involved with a project called the Permafrost Discovery Gateway that's trying to build a Pan-Arctic model of permafrost feature dynamics that's at kind of the sub-meter scale. And so it's doing a lot of machine learning on satellite imagery that's spread around the globe. And we're having challenges both with access to the data, which are currently spread out among multiple different locations, They're very large data. Each of the data sets is a petabyte and a half or more. And those data sets, need to go to a compute resource where we have sufficient cycles to really do the machine learning and feature extraction work that we want to do. Because of various restrictions on compute platforms, getting enough compute cycles to actually do this project is a pretty big challenge. And so it's National Science Foundation funded, and so it's really focused on Exceed as the compute platform. Exceed doesn't have the data that we need to do the processing. And so how do we, let's say that, we want to use, a ton of digital globe imagery in this case. Digital globe doesn't provide a compute platform. The Polar Geospatial Data Center, the PGC, the Polar Geospatial Center provides the data but doesn't provide the compute. So how do we make that next step to do what you're proposing, David? I think it's a great idea, but it feels like there are some inherent challenges here.
Yeah, there are unquestionably challenges, and we'll have to see where the world ends up. But I think Europe is ahead of most of the world on this. You need a balance. You can't have all big data sets spread all over the place. You need some level of centralization. You do want authoritative data centers, so that the people who have responsibility for the data are the custodians. And you need some level of distributed processing. Canada is currently looking at this. They're looking at following the European model, but the system's definitely broken in Canada. I think it's a lot less broken in Europe, and I'm probably less familiar with the United States, but I think the United States has a lot of strengths. It just needs to coordinate them. So yeah, I probably don't have a good answer for you.
Here.
Yeah, on the European side, I mean, there are very large, European Commission-driven initiatives to get the data in order, and for the European Open Science Cloud, etc., which is both a strength, but at the same time, a lot of those things are created by a few expert working groups that are not necessarily aware of how other people are operating within Europe and also further afield. And so it kind of, but I can also understand where that's coming from, because there's so many moving parts to this, and so many people want their own thing, own standard to be implemented. And ultimately Europe's like, okay, we'll do it a little bit top down, and let's see what happens, and then open it up for consultation. The consultations are advertised, they're open, but most scientists certainly never are not tuned into those channels. That's a different kind of game. So, but at the same time, it's kind of working in a strange way. But at the same time, this is why I'm so interested in groups like the group here, the Ocean Group, and others, kind of getting together as an almost semi-political entity to be able to talk up to that level and get the representation and sort of smooth it out as the transition happens. It's good it's happening, but I wouldn't give the impression that it's just, happy days and we've figured everything out.
Yeah, I have to say I'm horrified by the amount of duplication in Europe, but they're making progress. So is it the most efficient possible way to do it? Maybe not, but
it's happening. Yeah,
it's happening. Yeah,
I've been to so many meetings under the FAIR banner of different groups, and first thing, we're not going to reinvent the wheel, and then they promptly reinvent the wheel, like almost the second talk. But then people who are there from other communities sort of raise their hand and say, "Look, this is already done." There's a little bit of territorialism, but people are gradually seeing that the game is changing, and I think that sort of cultural change is the main value.
So Pier, I just put in a not very well written post in the chat. I think that's critical, because even yesterday in one of our presentations, one of the presenters said, when I'm thinking about developing an online presentation of data, that's where I think about using data as a service. But if I'm doing my own science, I wouldn't do that. I would simply download it and work on it on my desktop. So there's, I think, a disconnect both in terms of what people understand, in terms of what's possible with these newer models, and also just a cultural thing, particularly with older researchers.
Yeah, it happens.
It's always the way I've done it. And that, I think, David, is my understanding of it's broken. because we're still running into that every day as to, well, this is the way I've done it, so why do it differently? So,
right. And that's where, like, that's that new generation training aspect that comes in again, because at least with my students, if I can't just reproduce their study from their code, which will access like a data store somewhere where their data has been uploaded to a trusted archive, then that's not going to work well for them in terms of grading. I need it to be reproducible. Otherwise, it's not data science.
Okay, thank you. Okay, other thoughts on that?
Yeah, my thought is that this is a really frustrating process because there's so many side conversations I'd like to have right now, but oh well.
Well, that brings me to a topic that's come up a number of times, and we've certainly been talking about follow-on and community building, and how do we keep these conversations going? What are the best platforms to do that, or the best fora? One thing that came up yesterday was the value, and also this morning, the value of doing virtual meetings, and that's a necessity at the moment, but even in the future, to keep momentum going, to keep these relationships building. So we have AOS right now, Arctic Observing Summit. That followed on our last major meeting, at least as the sort of polar data community was in Helsinki. Even that's a bit of a gap. Things slow down, people go off, they do their own thing, and the conversations maybe slow, if not stop. So an idea put forward is to start thinking about regular online, virtual meetings of this sort. And Arctic Data Committee has been playing a role in organizing some of these events, and I think I spoke to Alan Pope in the last session about maybe getting some IAS support to help do that, as well as SAON Secretariat support, etc. So I want to put that out there just to see what people's feelings are, that if we were to move forward on creating something that's maybe regular, if not frequent, quarterly, something like that we can bring people together. And then of course, if we need side events, we could spin those off, and organized with respect to what people need. But before sort of taking any action on that, I wanted to get people's feeling on the value of that. Is it too much? If it is, what would our alternatives be? And Shannon, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I meet quarterly for the Polar Libraries Colloquy Steering Committee in a virtual meeting because we're international. And we also meet, Ruth isn't here, but I think it's monthly for the Semantics Working Group. And both of those work very well for keeping in touch and working towards goals of the group and making sure that they stay on track. I find it very useful and not that difficult to do. I've also found this AOS meeting, getting up in the middle of the night notwithstanding, to be, it's a great way to meet. I find it very helpful.
Great, and I am thinking a little bit at a higher level in the sense that we do have, we have the Polar group, we have semantics, we have the ESIPs of the world, but this would be more bringing together, the broader conversation and not strictly data. What I would be thinking about is having, the Sandy Starkweathers and others of the world engaging as well, so that we're not having to, again, just sort of report back, that they can be part of the conversation so we can make those connections more directly. So, any thoughts on that would be helpful.
I think it's a good idea.
Okay, well, we have one, but again, this is where, I just want to get, if people do have opinions one way or the other, it would be helpful. I mean, we could stick with our kind of approach we've been doing, which has been kind of just more organic. But I'm also mindful that we have feedback that sometimes that's not frequent enough or not regular enough. Matt?
Yeah, so I think the virtual meetings are really useful. I did suggest it yesterday, and I think it's a great idea. I think the challenge is keeping them focused so that we're really working on moving forward. We all do have limited time. So I like the ones where we have a mission in mind, and the virtual meetings are more working meetings. I think conferences are great, and this Arctic Observing Summit is great to sort of bring people together to kind of have general discussions, but it's also hard to get kind of focused and move forward on things. So I like the Polar Semantics Working Group and the Science on Schema.org group. Those kinds of focused activities, I think, really help us come to agreement and start building things together instead of in our stovepiped kind of funding driven environments. So I would be all for supporting more of those kind of working relationships. I don't know how many sort of general conferences like this one, especially because, like Shannon said, the time zone's a killer, we could really do, but yeah.
Okay, that's very helpful, and I think one thing I'd like to explore coming out of this is what we talked about yesterday, a joint meeting perhaps, or some sort of connection between Polder and the Science on Schema.org group, whatever that looks like. And so I'll maybe bring that up with Taco and Pip and Alex and others in Polder. And I think Polar Semantics is sort of evolving into a pretty functional group. For this broader type thing, there's we will be looking at organizing Arctic Data Committee meeting in the fall. And I think that one will almost certainly be virtual, or I'm going to be pushing for that just for a whole bunch of reasons. But Pier.
Yeah, I think I like that idea to have those sort of working meetings. It's worked for us in the ESIP clusters to actually use a 1 hour or 2 hour slot to do something. And it's motivating because, again, as Matt said, we're all really busy people, we're overcommitted. But if you have the same amount of time that's usually just a call, but you're actually developing something slowly, that's usually more progress than we're able to do offline, so to speak. And one could imagine that if we had a rolling hackathon that sort of goes across time zones around the world, where one regional team hands over to the next one as the time zones go by, that would actually help us be more interoperable, because we'd have to work with what the previous team has done. So maybe something like that would actually be quite healthy.
Yeah, and I think Ruth has stepped off now, but Ruth's been involved in a couple of those. And so that's what I was thinking, not just for hackathons, but also meetings like this. It's tough on the organizers, but we could just have a rolling sort of set of conversations, or in the hackathon sense, yeah, being able to build on what other people have done. Matt, do you have another comment, or is your hand?
Oops, yeah, sorry. I actually do have a comment, but I forgot my hand was up.
Okay.
Yeah, the Mozilla Science Lab has done a lot of those global rolling hackathons that have been really interesting. And so they've if you look through their community call notes, there's a bunch of references to how they try to handle a global hackathon that rolls through time zones. I think it's a great exercise. It would be fun to try.
Okay. I certainly, the feedback I've received from the recent Polar meetings, overall it's been positive, but the most positive has been around the hackathon components of them. And I think that's what most people have said they found useful, is that it's given them a chance to get together and roll their sleeves up and do some work. So I think any energy that we have, or the resources we do have, maybe if we can focus on that rather than the general conferences, and just leave the general conferences maybe to things like Arctic Science Summit Week, or things that are going to happen anyway. Other comments or questions?
There's an interesting comment from Anne in the chat. Peter.
Yes, absolutely, Anne, and thanks, Anne, for that comment. This was a big part of our conversation in session 3 of this working group earlier today, and this idea of engaging various users, linking to needs and societal benefits. That was sort of the details of some of the high-level points I made right at the beginning of this session. The questions there, you highlight one of them. Virtual meetings are a challenge in that regard. Resourcing is a challenge, and then of course the capacity within communities. And so we talked a little bit today about trying to leverage and bring in, so if people are already doing that kind of work in their research or, you know, in a community-led project, how do we connect that rather than adding yet another sort of project or demand on the community? And of course, yeah, Mark points out that the plenary panel, this comes up all the time, actually, with respect to communities, both the need to do it and then also the challenges of doing it. But yeah, any thoughts you have, Anne? I know you do a lot of work in communities, and if you have thoughts there too on what would be productive.
Hi, Peter, it's Anne. I guess the only option I would suggest is making sure that when we do virtual meetings, we have some sort of teleconference capability at the same time, so they can just phone in.
Yeah, and then also something that probably wasn't done as well as need be here is just, you know, making, if there are presentations, you know, make them available for download. You know, often they can access, it just can't access in real time and so on. So I think that's important. And then just figuring out, you know, how do we organize something that's going to be, you know, useful to them in the community. And that's something, you know, in a few projects I'm on, we're trying to figure that out and go in carefully so that, you know, they're not inundated with materials or with, you know, proposals that really don't make sense, that there's that background work done to understand what they're really trying to achieve and how that would work for the community.
So I'd be more than happy to help with solving this puzzle because it applies directly to what I'm doing, as you know.
Certainly. Okay, thank you. So that'll be definitely a highlight, which come up many times, is this idea of just broader engagement overall, and then particularly the partnership co-production models and so on, and how they work in the real world. Okay, any other comments? We have about 15 minutes or so left in our scheduled time. So if people have any kind of wrap-up comments, that would be great.
You said this at the beginning, Peter, but could you maybe say a bit more about what your plan is for the next session, the actual writing session?
Okay, so there is a scheduled session today at, I'm just double checking here, 21:30 to midnight GMT. So depending where you are, that translates into this afternoon or this evening. Between now and then, I'm going to try and put a little bit of background information together, some of the notes. Unfortunately, because of the change, I have a thesis defense that I have to be in for 3 hours in that time period, and a little prep time for that. So Shannon's likely going to get that one kicked off because the defense will probably bleed over into a conflict. But trying to get some done later today. And then there's a session from 11 to 1300 GMT tomorrow, so 7 a.m. my time, 5 a.m. your time. And I think trying to put together just really pretty high level document then for feeding into the broader process, the AOS process, but then we're also planning to, we'd like to sort of then start turning that into a statement that's a little more developed, and then give our community a bit of time for commentary over maybe the next couple of weeks or so. Next week and a half has been discussed.
So, but you want us then there writing, or
I would say
finalizing for the topics? Or
if you're keen, I wouldn't expect most people on this call to join, but if you're keen to, feel free to join us. I also know how difficult it is to write with a larger group of people. So what I may suggest is that, yeah, if this is something that you're keen to do and maybe have some experience in doing, join. And if not, then if you can just keep an eye on, your emails or other communication mechanisms. And as we put things together, be prepared to comment. Again, I don't know, given the very, very tight time frames between now and tomorrow, that we would do much more than try and just put together a summary of some of the topics that we've talked about. But then, you know, we have a chance to go beyond over the next week and a bit to try and hone that down and refine it.
So one thing so RDA's been having its virtual meetings these weeks as well. And one session that I attended that I thought worked really well, it was on whether to establish a fair digital objects working group, we had a period where, the chair had helpers in the background, which made a big difference as well, but set up sort of a table, and then we had an 8-minute or 10-minute session where we were actually all quiet and everybody wrote on their ideas on what, you know, we should be trying to do with this working group. So that actually really helped focus the conversation following that. They got very clever and did a word cloud and stuff like that. I'm not suggesting that we do that, but having some quiet time to let everybody write and then see that and digest it, I think might be helpful.
Yeah, that would be great. And I think we could do that starting in the next session. I like the idea of so when you say table, you mean sort of like spreadsheet type table and people do that in their own
space?
This
was, yeah. So they had a name, you know, they set it up ahead of time. You don't necessarily need to do this. I mean, people also can just write on their own computer and then paste it in at the end. But it was just, in this case, it was a table with your name and then like a topic column and then a description of the topic. But I mean, it depends on what we want to try and do. I mean, we've identified some themes, I think, over the last few days, and I haven't attended all the sessions, but that, you know, maybe you pick one of those themes and say, all right, here, let's take 5 minutes to flesh out what we mean by that theme and see what that happens with that, something like that. I'm just making this up, but
yeah, no, I like the idea, and that was generally what I'd like to try and do in the next session, is to set out sort of our structure at least, and figure out, you know, what are the key things. So I've been taking notes, of course. Shannon has the detailed notes that she's been taking. So we have a lot to work with, and then if need be later, we also have the recordings of every session if we need to go back to the original. But I like that in terms of the approach and the structure of doing it. So I don't know if you're available, but if you and anybody else on the call would be interested, we could, I think, start that process, at least probably get it set up, and then maybe send out a link. Unfortunately, I think, you know, Shannon's been taking attendance, etc., but I don't necessarily have like an email list for everybody who's been participating. But we could put up a link maybe on the site or something like that, the AOS site. And Shannon, sorry, I haven't been watching the hands up. Go ahead.
It's just logistical, Peter. We've had some questions in the chat about when the writing sessions are, and I said that it would be today. The 9:30 p.m. to 12 a.m. GMT slot is going to be scheduled for writing, as well as the slot tomorrow. And Pier Luigi was just double checking that we would be sharing a document in Google. I'm assuming whether we do a spreadsheet or a document for tracking, it would probably be in Google given the virtual nature, Peter?
Yes, that is correct. So just pointing here, this is the document that's linked to the AOS. So if you go to working groups, and you should see my screen, and then you go to working group 4, there's a thing that says message from organizers, which is really an agenda. So yeah, session 5 later today, and then session 6 are slated as statement writing sessions. And so ideally, yeah, we can maybe get going in the first session to set out a clear structure, documented. I have a number of notes and key points that I'm going to try to get in there, even if I can, before the defense starts. And Shannon, you have the notes. But And then for tomorrow would be more refinement, and we can try and extract that into key points. I think the organizers are not necessarily looking for fully wordsmith documents, but some key points that, that we can pull out of this.
Peter, I just want to note that I just put my detailed notes into the chat for people's reference.
Great. Shannon, could I ask you to, at the top of the detailed notes, for now, if you could just put a section that says user-defined key themes and priorities, something like that. Key themes would be better. And so if you have thoughts on, you know, what you definitely think should be going into this statement, please add. And then we can use that as a starting point for the table later today. And Mark, if you are available and could make it on time, that would be great. Shannon's going to be getting us going. I just don't know if the defense will take 2 or it's up to 3 hours, and that would create the conflict I mentioned. So I might be a bit late for that, and you guys could get started. Great. On that, and then I'll step in as soon as I'm finished with the defense, which is also a virtual event. Okay, any other thoughts, comments in the few minutes that we have remaining? Okay, well, that's great. Thanks so much for your time. I know many of you have spent a lot of time online here over the last couple of days, and I really appreciate that, and also for your input and willingness to contribute. Shannon, I just note that you have hand up.
I do. If we do want to create some kind of a email list for the people from this group, I just wanted to say that if people can fill out the participant list, that would be a way to get the email addresses of the people involved, because I have been keeping track of who is in the session. That's on the very first page of the AOS2020 agenda.org. If you scroll down, you'll see check out the participant list, and you could fill out the form if you're not yet on it. And I don't know how you got on it prior to them posting this, because, for example, Peter and I were not on it. I don't think you still are, Peter. It's super funny. So yes, but it's very easy to fill out, and that way we would have contact information if you so choose. Anyway, thank you. Or I guess alternately, you could also add it into the working document that I just linked to. One of those. That's everything. Sorry about that, Peter.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you, and thank you, Matt. Said, as long as there's some value in it, I think we're all in this together. So let's keep at it, and despite the compressed time frame, we'll do what we can do for tomorrow AM, and then keep that going. So let's call it a day, or at least a session, and then we'll go on from there.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.